sewage backups are a real part of owning a rental property. The big problems and the terrifying calls are, hey, by the way, the sewage is backing up into the house at midnight and is going all throughout the basement, etc. Because that's also a problem that needs to be remediated ASAP.
Welcome to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association, providing benefits and services to real estate investors and rental property owners for over 48 years. With your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group.
This episode is sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com. Hello and welcome to episode 254. Today, we're going to talk about the dirty and gritty side of investing in real estate and the unglamorous aspects that most rental owners have to deal with, such as septic cleanups, eviction cleanouts, pre-1920s construction, and investing in C, D, and even F neighborhoods. These are the parts of our business that people rarely think about that can actually be quite profitable. And here to share his experience in this area is Mike Bonadies, a landlord and co-owner of New Jersey-based property management company called TerraVestra, as well as a maintenance, preservation, and construction company called Side By Side MRO. Mike owns 25 units of small multifamily and mixed use, and he manages 225 units. His maintenance and preservation company has worked on over 600 units and foreclosures, and they specialize in pre-1940 multifamily construction. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brian, for having me on. I'm a big fan of the show already. I really appreciate you having me here, and I can't wait to talk about some of the more grittier elements of property management and rentals.
Well, I'm looking forward to that too, because I think when you buy a property, you're buying the problems of that property. It's not just the numbers on a spreadsheet, which are very important as well, but it's the actual property, its physical condition, and all the issues that surround that. And I'm really looking forward to getting into that. But first, I want to start with you and just find out who you are and how you got started investing in real estate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have a pretty stereotypical story. I was working in a corporate job before I became a landlord. I was working for DeWalt Power Tools, of all places. So I worked for them. I did a lot of the deal negotiation with big like Home Depot and Lowe's and whatnot. And a friend of mine who was down the cubicle row heard me. He always heard me negotiating. He's like, Bonadies, you negotiate these contracts. You should think about landlording. And I said, what do you mean? He's like, it's pretty much the same thing that you're doing, but you can make more money for yourself. And I started looking into it, and then one thing led to another. I hacked my first duplex. I moved back to where I'm from originally, South Jersey, and I started buying more properties. And I built up my portfolio, got a few doors underneath me, and then I realized there's a number of people that were coming to me because they saw me how I managed my properties, and they're like, yo, can you help me do this? Can you help me do this with the township? Can you help me do this with my rental? And that led to us creating a property management company. And my partner in the property management company already had a foreclosure cleanout business. His name's Drew Side. We brought those two elements of property management and his foreclosure business together. And we're like, why don't we do a larger scale construction business? And that led to us developing Side By Side MRO. And from there, things kind of trickled. We'll get into it, but we saw a big need in pre-1940 multifamily construction. We were already familiar with those housing types. And that's kind of where we grew from there, and that's where most of our branding is in which we call cleanouts and pre-1940 multifamily construction, where there is a massive need. There's not a lot of people doing it, but it can be incredibly lucrative if you do it correctly.
Well, I want to go back to when you first started investing and find out more about area you were investing in, the type of neighborhoods and the type of properties, and some of your early experiences with actually owning rental property?
I think the early part of my career really helped led to the later part because most of the properties I was buying were multifamilies. My first property I ever bought was a multifamily. It was a 1948 duplex, which I still live in today in House Hack. But shortly thereafter that one, I bought 3 duplexes and a quadplex on the same package. And the youngest of those buildings was 1930. I believe the oldest was 1910. So they were all older construction buildings, and they sat in a solid C neighborhood. When we bought those duplexes, there's a lot of problems that come with those older properties, and we didn't know everything about it at that time. We knew a decent chunk about like, hey, okay, we expect these problems, and we kind of know how to fix most of these things. But we learned a lot about that older construction as we were going through the rehabs of those properties, because all of those properties needed a significant portion of rehab done to it. So my first properties, I was cutting my teeth on older construction and as well as C neighborhoods. So, working class, blue collar neighborhoods, and those properties, we picked them up for a pretty good discount, because not too many people want to get pre-1940 construction as their first property, because there's a lot of surprises. There's a lot of skeletons in the closet. And that's absolutely the case we ran into. There was a lot of surprises into it. But as long as you buy it at the right price, and you're flexible to rehabbing it, it'll go pretty, it can become a very lucrative deal.
What were some of those surprises and skeletons in the closet that you found?
Yeah, plumbing. Well, here, let me to tee up why pre-1940 is I think an important number to look at, or pre-1950 construction. I believe it was 1948 or 1950 or 1952, somewhere around there, where construction code was implemented. I believe it was across the nation, but I know specifically in New Jersey, construction code started being implemented. So anything before that 1948 timeframe, there was no construction code. It was, your grandfather building a house, and they were doing it however they thought should be done. So nothing is done consistently across any of the buildings, and it's all kind of done to what was thought, or what whoever was building it thought it should be done. So there wasn't a unified code that was laying out how houses should be constructed. So that creates a lot of different things that you're going to find when you're rehabbing those properties. For instance, we find a lot of the wrong diameter pipes being used for sewage, which creates backups and creates problems later. We find that the wiring it looks like a Kraken usually. When you get to the panel box, there's just wires going everywhere. You've got partial knob and tube, you've got partial Romex, you've got the partial cloth wiring coming out. And a lot of times, you can see people will say on these older houses where it's like, oh, it's got updated electrical on the house. And you look at the panel and it's a modern panel. And you're like, okay, cool. Modern panel, modern wires leaving the panel. Great stuff. This looks like updated electrical. And then 1 foot above where it goes into the wall, there's a separate panel box that is not a knob and tube disconnect. That Romex went right into the knob and tube disconnect, which is above it. And then it goes, the rest of the house is knob and tube. It's just behind the walls. So that's a lot of the problems that you find in these houses when you're going through the renovation. And a lot of times you don't realize it until something fails. So let's say an outlet doesn't work. You pull out the back of the outlet and you look and you're like, that's a knob and tube wire going down into an area where I didn't see a knob and tube disconnect below it. So you see a lot of those issues come up when you're starting to do the renovation. And everybody know, or I think it's somewhat common knowledge when you start to tear walls down in those older houses, you find all kinds of interesting things. Not in these particular houses, but we've done construction where we've pulled out a wall to a older, I think it was a 1919 built single family home. We pulled out a wall in a bathroom, and there was a separate bathroom behind that bathroom that was just completely walled in for, we want to say, we were guesstimating around 20 or 30 years it had been walled in, and you just find it there, and you're just like, oh, cool. Just got to tear out that plumbing and deal with it now. So that's some of the isms that you'll find when you're doing some of this construction in older houses.
Well, I love how you just educated us on the construction codes and how pre-1955 or whatever year it was, people just did it. They didn't have best practices. They just kind of did it the way that they thought it should be done. And then you talk about the different types of wiring, and that's very important. Can you educate us as well on the different types of wiring? You know, you mentioned Romex, knob and tube, I'm sure copper wiring, and how, what kind of the timeline that those came into being?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a regional element to this, so it's going to be different wherever you are in the United States. The more problems are going to be found on the East Coast, or let's say the more problematic types of wiring are going to be found on the East Coast, and then the more West Coast you get, the less problems you have with this. But when you're looking at anywhere between the late 1800s to 1930-ish is when you're going to find knob and tube. Knob and tube gets a bad rap because there's insurance companies don't like it. A lot of insurance companies won't insure properties that have knob and tube. You can tell if you have a knob and tube wiring because you're going to see these white modules or nodes that are about as large as my fingers are, the gap right here, on either the rafters of the attic, or you'll find them in the basement in between the beams, and there's this thin black line that runs in between these nodes. The reason it gets a bad rap is because the wires can easily break, or the wires may be exposed and they create fire hazards. When you're leaving the 1920s, the 1930s, and you're going into that 1940 to 50 construction, in South Jersey and Delaware and where I'm from, and Philadelphia, where I'm from, you have something called cloth wiring. And cloth wiring is, imagine the Romex on a cable today, which is like that plastic sheathing that covers the wire. Instead of it plastic, it's cloth. So that creates a problem for many investors because the cloth had a half-life to it. It disintegrates. And right about now is when all the cloth is disintegrating. So if you have let's say you have an outlet on the second floor and it's cloth wiring that runs through the house, you go out to change that outlet or fixture. The wire will actually start to disintegrate while you're working on it. And that creates a problem because you have to start rerunning lines from the basement or for wherever the panel box is, which creates problems. Once you start moving to that 50s, 60s, you start getting to the more standard type of wiring, the Romex covered in plastic sheathing. There's another form of Romex, I can't remember the name of it, but it's still more durable. The one thing that is, I think, also unique, again, it's bigger in PA, New Jersey. I think it was common in New York for a little bit. I'm sure that you'll find it somewhere else in the United States, is aluminum wiring. And that is just a death trap. Aluminum wiring was popular in the late 60s, early 70s. And aluminum wiring is an aluminum wire. It's not a copper wire. And the problem with aluminum wiring is that it will melt and burn down the house if it overloads. So you see that with late 60, early 70 construction. For us, where anything where the Levitts had built was a big area that you'd seen that you would see the aluminum wiring.
I'm sorry. What did you just say? Anywhere where the Levitts had built?
Yeah, Levitts. They were a big developer in the 70s in PA, New Jersey, Delaware, New York. They had built thousands of homes, and they used aluminum wiring.
Okay, so they left a big problem for all their homeowners.
Yeah, they didn't know at the time that it was bad, so I guess fair to them. But it creates a problem for us investors later.
So what do you want to see? I mean, is copper wiring Romex, is that the standard nowadays?
Yeah, you want to see, if you see the Romex, like the plastic sheathing on it, that's that what you would see in, let's say, if you're not an electrician, or if you're not too familiar with construction, if it looks like it's something you would see coming out of a computer with its sheathing, that's a good sign. That's a good sign. But I think it's a fair warning to any investor who's buying an older house. If you see that on the face level, it might not be there when it's behind the walls. It might just be there going up into the wall. And then afterwards, you might have had a lazy electrician, or they might have just changed the panel, and only a few wires are rewired that way. So that's some of the pitfalls that you see with some of that older construction.
I'd like to take a moment to tell you about Green Property Management. Not only do they manage everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area, they also manage my entire portfolio. So I can tell you from personal experience that their unique flat fee management style is worth a closer look. If you feel that your property isn't operating to its fullest potential, then Green Property Management can help you take a holistic approach that will save you money, eliminate your headaches, and increase your net income. And if you're a property manager interested in applying Green Property Management's model, give them a call at 1-866-95-GREEN or visit them on the web at greenpropertymgt.com. So what do you do then? I mean, do you open up all the walls to make sure you don't have aluminum wiring, or what? Are there clues and signs that you can follow?
Honestly, I think you got to go into the house, if you're buying older construction, knowing that you're going to have these problems. I mean, we buy the properties, or clients that I deal with buy the properties at such a low cost that if they have a problem like this, that they just fix it. A lot of times the electrical is still useful. You don't want to go out and redo all the electrical and all the plumbing if you don't have to. But that being said, you don't buy the deal at such a marginal rate that if something like this comes up, that it blows out your deal, that it totally takes your shirt off your back because you didn't have enough margin built into the deal. So I think the one thing is you got to buy the deal good enough. The second is get either a property manager or get a contractor who's familiar with that kind of construction to take a look at the property with you. If you're if you buy properties and you're a professional investor, it shouldn't be that hard to have, you're going to have your network of contractors. I'm sure there's one of them that knows this kind of construction or somewhat familiar with it that can look at the property for you. Now, if you're a newbie though, and this is the first property that you're going to be buying, you're probably going to have to pay for not maybe an inspection, but pay a contractor to go out there and take a look at the property with you. A lot of times the contractors that are doing this older construction, they're priced at a premium because they have a lot of knowledge and talent, and their jobs are relatively expensive. So to pull them off of the job site, to have them look at a property that they may not get the business on, you'll probably have to pay for them to do it. But the contractors are out there. You just got to reach out to your network and say, hey, do you have any familiarity with, doing construction from, 1900 or 1875 or, 1890? And if they say yes, then, you have them take a look at it, and they'll tell you, hey, this is going to be a problem 5 years from now. This is going to be a problem right now. This is a problem when it finally breaks down. And that's what we do with, I know, our clients, and I know there's a couple others that do it in the state like us. And we'll go to the property and be like, all right, here's a problem. Here's a problem 5 years from now. Here's a problem 10 years from now. And it's usually the contractor that's going out and looking at the house. The caveat with inspectors on this is there's some really good inspectors that will tell you the truth on the properties. But if it's an inspector who might only have been in the game for 3 or 4 or 5 years, or they're younger and they don't do a lot of construction with this, they're going to light up the house and say the whole thing's a problem. When reality is it's problems that you can work through over time as long as the deal has enough margin, if that makes sense.
I'm curious about the hidden bathroom. Why would a bathroom be behind a bathroom walled off for, what would you say, about 40 years?
Yeah, it looks like it was about walled off for about 40 years based on the wallpaper that we saw. I don't have a clue why. I think more than likely we a cheap repair potentially with some of these older homes, and especially if you were if it was a slumlord who previously owned this, is let's say there's a problem with the plumbing leaving the bathroom, or there's a problem with the entire, let's say the subfloor or something like that, and they didn't want to pay to do the proper fix. We have seen where people will just wall off a room, and then they just, because it's cheap to get a vanity, it's cheap to get another toilet, and then you just tie it into the already existing plumbing. They may have been looking for a cheap fix versus a proper fix from a problem that occurred, when they owned the property.
Is that a bonus to you then? Because now you have extra space for a bigger bathroom, or does it present real world problems that you have to overcome?
That particular case, it was a bonus because there wasn't big problems. When it becomes problematic is you find a crawl space in a basement that has asbestos HVAC that was just from who knows how long ago. And then the proper thing is to clean it all out. So that's when it becomes a costly problem. So really depend, it's situation by situation. But I think if you're doing a full rehab to the building anyway, it's probably not a problem. Where it becomes a problem is if you weren't expecting to do a full rehab and you find a hidden problem. Another one like this would be underground oil tanks, right? Like you find an underground oil tank after you've already bought it. That's never any fun. And that's just costly to the investor.
Is that something you have to remediate immediately, or can you just leave it underground and forget about it?
The proper answer is you're supposed to remediate it right away. I think a lot of times it goes in New Jersey, we're township by township, where the local municipal code may kick in, but you want to probably remediate it right away. Now, that being said, I'm sure there's times when you may realize you have an underground oil tank and it's a no, what is it? How do they say in the military? No tell, no. You just don't want to mention
ask,
it.
Don't tell.
That's it. Don't ask, don't tell.
Yeah. So explain to our listeners who might be confused about why you would have an underground oil tank.
Underground oil tanks, or oil was the preferred fuel for heating during, I want to say it was the mid-20s up until pretty much the 60s in my area. I know that fluctuates where you're at depending on the nation. So instead of having gas sent to the property, they had oil tanks on the property, and those oil tanks may have been placed in the basement. They may have been placed on the side of the house, or someone had the idea of let's dig up the ground and put the oil tank in the ground, and where that oil tank held the fuel that would heat the boiler, that would power the boiler, that would heat up the house. And the EPA stepped in, I want to say 60s, 70s, somewhere around there, saying, hey, if you've got an oil tank in the ground and it's leaking, you have to remove all of the oil tank and then its leakage from the property the proper way. Now, if the oil tank's not broken, not really a big problem. You just pop the oil tank out of the ground. But at this time where we are in 2020, a lot of the oil tanks have rusted in some capacity. So there's like either a pinhole hole or it started to break away, and the oil has started to leak into the ground, which means you have to excavate all of that oil or contaminated soil out. Where it becomes really problematic and really expensive is when the oil has leaked through the ground into the water table or an underground river, which is somewhat common down here in South Jersey because our water table is quite high. And once that gets into the water ground source, then you just have to it's like nonstop excavation. And luckily I've never been part of something that extensive. before. I do have partners that have been, and that's where they have it's the remediation can be upwards of $100,000 at that point. So
essentially, you have a toxic waste site that needs to be remediated.
Bottom line, yeah. Bottom line.
I love how you're educating us on all the different things. I want to turn our attention now to septic tanks and sewage backups, because I know that's something that you have experience with as well. What can you tell us about those things?
Sewage backup, I think it's easier to start with sewage backups and then kind of move into septic. Sewage backups are a real part of owning a rental property. It's kind of like one of those, people always fear, they're like, oh, what if the toilet's overflowing, or what if the toilet doesn't work at midnight? Honestly, that's an easy problem because it can be fixed tomorrow and you can just turn off the water. When the big problems and the terrifying calls are, hey, by the way, the sewage is backing up into the house at midnight and it's going all throughout the basement, etc. Because that's also a problem that needs to be remediated ASAP. And we've had to deal with those. A lot of times you see this occur when someone puts your tenants put a toy down the sewage pipe. It gets backed up, and then it pops out of the clean, or it pops out of the utility sink if you have one of those in the basement, and starts flooding the basement with sewage. And that sewage needs to be cleaned up and remediated the proper way. Or even if you weren't doing it properly, it needs to be cleaned up and remediated. You just can't leave sewage in the basement for your tenants. It creates a health hazard, and no tenant wants to live in a property that has sewage in the basement. So one of the things that we suggest to our owners is always get sewage backup insurance for their properties. And the reason being is sewage cleanup is very expensive. There's not a lot of companies that are willing to go in there and clean up sewage and to wade through someone's feces and clean it up for a property owner. So it's very expensive, and there's very few companies that do it. It's not your average contractor. If you've got your handyman that says, hey, by the way, I know that you just you just framed out a door for me. Do you mind cleaning up 4 inches of poop for me? It's not the same person that does that usually. So we tell our owners, get sewage insurance. It's only maybe like $150 a year, but that will pay off dividends if you do have a problem. We went through 3 this past 60 days across our 225 rentals that had backed up into the basement. And usually it's a preservation or remediation company that has to come in and remediate the sewage. And that includes throwing down essentially what is the equivalent of kitty litter to pick up the liquids. Then they need to scoop up and get rid of the solids. They have to power wash the walls and everything that the sewage touched. They have to throw down antimicrobials on everything. And if the sewage is near, let's say, an electrical panel or near electrical lines, you have to put down barriers across all your electrical. So what seems to be a basic job of just, hey, scooping up poop and throwing it away actually has quite a few steps involved with it. And it's not usually a pleasant experience. Just a few, like maybe 100 square feet of sewage remediation could run you $3,000-$4,000 to remediate that, which could eat up your profit for a quarter or half a year on some of these properties. So that's a very real problem that can be experienced, and your property manager, or if you're self-managing, you need to know the right companies to call and deal with it, and it needs to be dealt with in a timely manner for the sake of your tenants. Now, moving on to septic systems, that's all. I mean, when you buy in rural areas, you tend to have. Actually,
Mike, let me interject there, because I've got a couple questions about sewage and backups. Flushable baby wipes, your opinion on them?
Oh, don't let your tenants flush down flushable baby wipes. They are not flushable, and they just cause backups. So
I hear that.
Put that in your lease.
And then the worst sewage backup you've ever encountered.
All right, I got one. This was a sixplex, and it was, I think, originally built as 2 duplexes, but it became a sixplex over the years. So the sewer line went across a cinder block barrier in the basement. There was 2 points of failure in the pipe, and the sewage came out on both sides of the cinder block wall. So we had about 100 square feet on both sides. It was about 4 inches deep. And it was just a lot of poop, and the problem is, because it's partitioned off by that wall, it's like doing 2 separate cleanups, and you have to go through the same process. So it's an expensive bill for the owner, and it's just you got to do it twice over, and it doesn't help when, let's say, you're in a building where the tenants are not cooperative. We ask them, please don't use the toilets while we're cleaning this up because the pipes are still broken or whatever. And then they proceeded to use the toilets still. So we're cleaning up the sewage, and there's more sewage coming out. And it's just, it's one of those things you're like, oh my God, I can't believe what's going on here. So, that was tough because it was just 2 jobs as one job. And you had to do both processes. And both sewage spills were right next to the electrical panel. So you had to cover up the electrical panel and all that kind of stuff. So it's just a very process intense sewage clean. The other sewage cleans, I'll do one more quick one. We've had to go up into a crawl space before. That is not fun for the companies doing it, because normally if you can just stand up, you can at least have all your body functions while you're cleaning up the sewage. When you're in a crawl space that might only be 3 feet high, that means you got to get your smallest guy to go in there and start shoveling, because crawl spaces are usually dirt, shoveling the dirt with the sewage out. Those are never fun either.
I'd hate to be the smallest guy on that team. Oh, man. I want to talk about septic as well. And please make sure all of our listeners understand what we're talking about when we say septic systems.
Yeah, so septic systems are found usually in rural areas of the United States. Septic system is an area, or let's say, most people are familiar with city sewer, right? You have this, you flush a toilet, it goes out a pipe to the city sewer system, and then it goes and the city collects the waste and deals with it. A septic system has a sewage getting collected on the property within a certain area where it is then put into the ground in some capacity. And there's 2 forms of septic systems. I'll keep it really high level. The first is a septic system that actually has what you would call a septic tank and then a leaching field in it, where the solids are eaten by bacteria that you placed in the tank, and then the liquids are percolated out to the field. And then the second form of septic systems is a cesspool, which actually predates septic tanks. And cesspools are just an area, a pit, let's say, where the sewage of the property is just dumped, and then it stays there, and over time, it goes away through natural ways, whether it be either you put bacteria down there to eat the sewage, or it just decays over time. The sewage is removed. Now, if you buy a property, which we have seen, because a lot of times these properties are very cheap, you buy a property that has a cesspool in it, you often have to convert it to a septic system or tie into city water. And sometimes if you buy a septic system, the town, when the purchase is done, the town may knock on your door and say, hey, we know that this had a septic system, but it changed ownership. We're going to make you tie into city water now. And that they may incur some costs. What I think it's important for investors to know is what's the condition of the septic system, whether it be a septic tank or a cesspool. If it hasn't been, if you're buying a foreclosure and the property hasn't been touched in 5 years, then it's best to assume that the septic system shot on it and you're going to have to replace it. And those replacements cost a lot of money. Some of again, I'm in South Jersey where prices are a little bit higher than other places. To replace a septic system for me, for a single family house, it can be $15,000, $17,000, $20,000 to do a new septic system or to convert a cesspool to a septic tank. And it usually involves engineering drawings and whatever it may be. Sometimes it might be cheaper just to tie into city water, where it might only be a couple $1,000s. But I think I've seen some nasty stories where someone has bought a rental. It had a septic system. It was a foreclosure. And after they started renovation, they realized they're going to need to replace the septic system, and their $30,000 budget just doubled because they had to replace the septic system. So I think it's important when you're buying those rural properties to really understand, is it city water? Does it have a septic tank? Does it have a cesspool? Even if it's tied into the city water, does it have a septic tank that was filled properly? Some people just dump cement into the septic tank and say, "All right, problem solved." And that might not be what the codes say for your town. So I think it's important for the investor to understand what's going on with those rural properties and their septic systems.
Wow, great explanation. Thank you for that. Staying with the idea of septic systems, I'd like to shift to plumbing and talk about what you look for, because I know that plumbing on these I own a number of old properties as well, the same age range as what you're describing, and plumbing is our number one issue. So talk about that, what you've encountered and some of the solutions you've come up with.
One of the things that we look for is the right size diameter pipes when we're purchasing a property, or one of my clients is purchasing a property for a lot of the older homes. A lot of times the diameters are not large enough for sewage to get through properly, and it may create slow drainage or backups later on. So that's one of the things that we look for is just having the right diameter size pipe in the basement exiting the property. The other thing we look for is it like a lot of the pipes that are older are cast iron. So even though they're cast iron, nature finds its way and roots still get into the pipes. So we make it a thing now where if we're buying a property, we always have the sewer scoped. Because if there's roots in the pipe, that means you got to dig out part of that pipe and replace it. If you wait till you get a tenant in there and then you're like, oh, well, everything should be okay. And then things start backing up. You might need a very costly or a very intense repair quickly, which will drive up the costs. So we always make sure to have the sewer scoped. The other thing that we look for is something called Orangeburg. Orangeburg was popular in the Northeast, again, during the same time aluminum wire was going in, and the pipes are essentially paper mache. It was old particle board that was essentially turned into this goop that hardened very well, and they were used as pipe or your sewage pipe leaving the property. The problem with Orangeburg is it decays over time. The pipes collapse essentially, and you might not. A lot of times that the bore will stay there, so sewage is still going out, but you might not really have a pipe there at all. So that's one of the things that we also look for is the presence of Orangeburg pipes, because if you have an Orangeburg pipe, you have to pretty much replace all of the sewage or all the lines in there. What we do to remediate a lot of this stuff is, if we do find any of it, we just proactively dig it up and put in PVC sewage pipes to remediate those types of problems that we discover. The other things from a convenience standpoint as a rental owner is, where are your cleans in the property? A clean is an area that you pull up or there's an open to the pipe, and you can stick a snake down there or a scope to deal with any sewage blockages. If you get a property that doesn't have a single clean in the basement, that means you're going in through the shower or through some other area above the house. unless they have a clean on the outside of the property, which may or may not be there. So if there's no cleans in the pipe, one of the things we proactively do is tell our customers, look, why don't we just replace part of this piping so we can get a clean in there? That way, if there's a blockage at all, we can stake the property much easier. If you don't have that, it's going to create headaches from a property management perspective later. The other element to take a look at for is cleans on the outside of the property. Now, the difficult thing with this is if you're buying an older property, that clean may be under a foot of dirt, just time building up over on top of it. So there's not a really great solution outside of sending a sewer scope down it and using one of the not the metal detector, but the radar detectors to find a clean using the sewer scope. So that's some of the things we proactively look at. One of the things we think that gets a bad rap, but isn't necessarily a problem, is lead pipes. Lead pipes, because it has lead in it. People are always like, "Oh my God, lead pipes! What's happening here?" I have a couple lead pipes in my properties that I own that are original pipes. They're literally 100 years old, and they are pristine. Lead pipes were built very well. So a lot of times we tell owners, unless the pipe is cracked or actually has a problem with it, don't replace lead pipes. They are built to last. So we think that gets a bad rap when it doesn't necessarily.
I think people are worried that the lead is going to get in their water, their drinking water.
Most of the time when we've seen the lead pipes, it's been on the sewage outbound. We have not seen it in the inbound pipes. So the concern has been none because it's always been on outbound.
One of the problems with pipes that I've had an issue with is polybutylene pipes. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but I owned a house in New Mexico that back in the 80s, I think it was, they used polybutylene. Basically, it wasn't a pipe that was built to last. It would start to crack and disintegrate. So I had to replace all the piping in this house. It cost me probably $5,000 or $6,000 to just go through and put in all new piping because the polybutylene needed to be replaced.
Ooh, was that inbound? Like, was that inside the house, or was it all the
It was all inside the house, all the plumbing inside the house. So that was a painful bill.
Yeah, that is. And did you find this out before it was occupied or after?
During. So it was a 1980s built house that we had a number of tenants in, and then we just kept having plumbing issues and needed to replace those.
And I think that's one of the key takeaways for like anybody who's buying a house that had problems with it. When you take care of it before it gets occupied, you create way less headaches when it gets occupied, because if you have a leak behind a wall while the tenant's there, you got to coordinate with the tenant. The tenant's going to be disgruntled. You're going to have to probably pay extra because you're going to need a faster repair than if it was vacant. So if you see the problems ahead of time, or there's a problem and your budget can afford it, take care of it before it happens. You'll deal with less management headaches.
Let's talk about eviction cleanouts, and because you deal with that a lot, cleaning out properties. What's your take on that? I mean, what are some of the experiences you've had, and what stands out to you? One
experience is never like the other with eviction cleanouts. It's always an interesting time doing either clean out or ejectment. The big takeaways are the clean out company that you hire to do the clean out, make sure they are familiar with the landlord tenant laws regarding the clean out, because there's usually some kind of law that governs what you can do with the tenant's belongings. So for instance, in New Jersey, the state I reside in, we have to let's say the tenant isn't there, is or isn't there, it doesn't even matter. If there are signs of life in the property, so let's say it looks like almost a normal house scene with belongings organized and there, we have to store their stuff for 30 days and then in a storage facility, and then you can either throw it out or you can auction it off or whatever it may be. So the clean out company needs to get a storage facility that will store the belongings in it, and then they have to remove it 30 days later after the proper time has gone by. If they don't do that, you could have some concerns with the tenant suing you after the fact, saying, "Hey, you took my belongings and you sold it or threw them out," when you shouldn't have done that. So I think having that familiarity is important when it comes to the clean out itself. A lot of times, you want guys, or you want to hire a crew that has multiple guys that can bring their own truck to move stuff to a facility, and we'll have at least 3 or 4 guys there to help move the stuff properly out. One of the things that I see, especially on an eviction that had occurred, that the house actually isn't in bad condition, there's just a lot of stuff. You don't want to hire your generic clean out company that will damage the property as they take out stuff. So, as an investor, you want to make sure that you can preserve as much of the property as possible. Where things get fun, fun from the preservations company, but let's say can go sideways from the investor standpoint, is when you have a hostile ejectment or hostile eviction, where usually the sheriff gets involved. From our state's perspective, the sheriff gets involved to remove the individual, but they may not want to leave. In that case, you want to have a crew that has temperament to deal with tenants screaming at them, yelling at them, harassing them as they remove things, because that's a very real aspect of removing or cleaning out after an eviction or after an ejectment. It might not be a very pretty situation, and you need to have a crew that can deal with that. Give
us an example of real life experience that you had to deal with along those lines.
Oh, all right. So a real life example is we had an ejectment. Ejectments are slightly different from evictions. Ejectments are you are removing people who do not have a claim to the house, whether it be through lease or a deed. Essentially, a property had been turned into a crack house, and there was like 13 people living inside of it, and it was absolutely infested with riffraff. We had to the police had to come. They called in. They came to say, "Hey, you got to get out." As you can imagine, none of these people knew they were being removed from this house. They had, from their perspective, they had taken over it. So it was quite hostile. You had people like pretty much staying at the property, like being within a foot of the people entering and leaving the house, cleaning out the house, just screaming at them about, "Hey, this is my stuff," et cetera, et cetera. Because it was an ejectment and this wasn't personal, we did not have to hold the belongings of this house. We were just throwing this out in front of the belongings of these individuals to this house. As they were leaving the house, they were punching holes through walls, etc. So they were trashing the house, and you kind of have to in our perspective, you kind of let the police, try to prevent that as much as possible. But at the same time, the crews that you have there have to be firm, and we had to be firm and be like, "Yo, get out!" You can't, let's say, be intimidated by the elements that were going on at this house, and just remove it. And it was just. It does, as I speak through it, it probably doesn't sound as exciting as it was when it was there, or that chaotic, but it's a lot of temperament that you're dealing with, because you have these people that are very unpleasant within feet away. And yes, there's one sheriff there, but if there is multiple people there and there's only one sheriff, it could lead to more. And
it sounds like it could get out of hand pretty quickly.
It could, but you have to have the right team. And my team was right at this time where they don't let that get to them. So they don't get hostile with the tenants. They're just saying they go in, they ignore, they get the job done. That's it. You don't want it to spill into over more than what it is.
You invest in C and D, and you even mentioned F type neighborhoods. Describe the difference between those types of neighborhoods, and why you would invest in a D or F neighborhood and actually be able to make money.
I look at, as a property manager, I look at A, B, C, D, F a little bit differently than I think the traditional, like a commercial investor would look at these terms. I look at it based by tenant demographic. So C neighborhoods are blue collar, blue collar working force, work labor, nurses, eds, construction workers. They make okay money, but they usually live paycheck to paycheck in some regards. So that's C neighborhoods. Usually no crime, or very a little bit of crime is being committed in the neighborhoods, and it's petty crime or drug related crime. It's nothing that drastic.
It's relatively safe.
Exactly. D neighborhoods is when you start to move into much more crime being taken place. It still might be blue collar, or it generally is blue collar, or lower income housing. And there's still there's more crime being committed here. You might have more burglary or arson or whatever it may be occurring inside the neighborhood. But the differentiation between a D asset and an F asset in my head is, on a D asset, the crime is not being committed at the property. It's in the neighborhood of the crime being committed, but it's not being committed at the property. F assets, crimes being committed at the property. You might be having problems there. A great example of this would be like, a pimp turning tricks at the property or whatever it may be. That's an F asset where you've got low income housing. You generally have maybe some hostile tenants, but crime is being committed on the property. How those assets can still be profitable, and just to clarify, I invest in D and C assets. I do manage some F assets. I can't say they're pleasant to manage, but I don't personally own any F assets. C assets are pretty straightforward. It's just like your generic rental property. D assets can still be profitable if you have the right systems and the right property management company that has thicker skin, that can manage and deal with some of the hostile tenants, or have no problem walking into these neighborhoods with crime in it, and can still collect the rent and still have all the correct operations in place. We have some Section 8 tenants that we have in these D neighborhoods. They're great people. They're fantastic people. They always pay. We collect rent with no problem. We have no problem with any of our tenants in those neighborhoods. We just need, we need to have staff that have no problem going into these neighborhoods known for problems. You can, as long as you're still collecting rent, you buy and a lot of times these D assets are incredibly cheap properties. It can be very profitable. You might be buying these properties at $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 a door. You might put $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 into the property, so you might have it for $60,000, and you might be collecting. It might be a duplex, and you're collecting $2,200 a month. You're right, like that's great as long as you have all the proper elements in place. The F assets that we manage, we are actively trying to turn them into D assets. We don't like to keep them as F assets. No one wants crime being committed on their property, so you buy an F asset trying to turn it into a D asset. And we've had some success with that. I will say, if you're an investor and you're trying to buy properties like that, be prepared for eviction expenses and other property damage expenses. You need to have a line item in your pro forma saying, hey, this is the cost of turning this unit or these units to turn it from an F asset to a D asset. If you don't prepare for yourself for that, you could lose your shirt in that deal. D assets, I think a lot of people get scared of them, but they are very viable as long as you have the right systems and the right people that don't mind going into those neighborhoods to do the right thing. Another tactic we use with those D assets is we do incredible turns on them. We turn them into C quality or B quality assets. We do granite countertops, new cabinets, hardwood flooring across everything. We really do the fully tiled bathrooms and kitchens, and we attract the best individuals from those neighborhoods to live there. And we'll have a line, 10 people long to get inside of one of our units. And then once we show that we're good, we're quality property or landlords, we'll have organizations like DIFUS, like Section 8, like Housing Choice Program that want to give us their best applicants and have us, hey, do you guys have any units open? We'd love to get one of these people in here with you because we know you're good people. We know that you're good landlords. And when you get that combination of the voucher programs, when to have your rooming, it can lead to some guaranteed rent coming in every month.
When you buy an F property, and you mentioned prostitution might be happening, and you gave the example of the drug dealer selling crack. What is the strategy you employ? Is it basically just evict immediately, or do you try to do cash for keys? I mean, what are some of the tactics that you can use to actually get rid of that element and start turning a profit?
Combination of pretty much the two that you said there, and then there's one other element I'll bring up. You cash for keys. You try to cash for keys. All the problem people that you think you're going to have. If they don't take the cash for keys, because a lot of times it's their place of business, so they don't want to necessarily, it's like a restaurant moving locations, right? Like you don't want to have, as a restaurant, you don't necessarily want to move locations because people know that your business is there. So they might not take the cash for keys. Then you want to start evicting immediately on them. The other tactic that we take to deter crime is we start investing on the exterior of the property heavily. We'll put more lights in. We'll put cameras in. We'll put deterrents that, let's say, make it harder to do whatever crime is being committed there to give them an incentive to leave. So, cash or keys, eviction, put lights and cameras on the properties to deter people from doing crime. A lot of times F assets aren't, when you buy them, they weren't being managed very well beforehand. So just showing up to the property more than once a month or once a quarter is also a deterrent as well. So those are all tactics that we take.
And cash for keys, by the way, is when you basically pay the tenant to move out. You say, here, we're going to give you some money to move out. What would you typically pay when you do cash for keys?
In New Jersey, where we're from, we're probably around $500 with this COVID stuff going on and like some of the eviction moratoriums going on. We're up to $1,000 for some of our worst offenders, but it's anywhere between $500 to $1,000.
And what's the percentage of people who actually take cash for keys?
I would say it's around, before COVID, it was probably close to 90%. Now that COVID's kicked in and it's kind of harder for a lot of people to find homes, I'm seeing that percentage drop down to 50. So it hurts us because it's being so publicized that you can kind of stay in the house and not have any problems and not have any recourse. So that hurts the cash for keys offers currently during the time of COVID.
And Mike, you're giving us so much great information here, and I'm really getting an education. I hate to wrap it up, but yet we're at the point here where we need to do so. Before we do that, though, is there anything else you want to share with us? Any other thoughts you had coming into this conversation that you want to include?
My main thing is pre-1940 construction gets a bad rap because it's built like a jigsaw puzzle. That can be such a profitable property from a rental perspective because a lot of them are multifamilies. If you can crack the code in your regional area, get a contractor that will work with you on this construction and get the properties cheap enough, it can be incredibly lucrative, especially as we see a lot more investors enter into the space and buy the houses built on slab and the easy construction. If you pivot your strategy to some of that pre-1940 stuff, you can find some incredibly profitable rentals. Just make sure that you understand them fully and you begin to learn how they're constructed so that you can navigate the pitfalls of them.
And if anyone wanted to get a hold of you or find out more about you, how would they do so?
Yeah, so I have 2 Facebook accounts. We post a lot on them. My property management Facebook's account is at TerraVestra Rentals. And then my property maintenance and construction company is at SBS MRO. Follow us there, and you'll see a bunch of cool stuff from the ejectments and flooding, basements, septic cleanups, or get all that fun stuff.
Well, I appreciate you sharing all that fun stuff with us. I mean, it's good to understand just the gritty, dirty reality of actually investing in rental property. I certainly am familiar with a lot of what you talked about because a lot of my properties are older as well. I really appreciate you sharing your stories and your experience with us today.
Thanks, Brian. It was a pleasure being on the show. Really appreciate you having me.
I want to thank everybody for listening to this episode. I'm your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group, and you can find out more about me by going to higinvestor.com. That's higinvestor.com. And you can also ask questions and join us on Facebook by going to RPOA, Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast. This episode was sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com.
You've been listening to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association. You can find out more at rpoaonline.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please go to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and review.